The island remembers in stone. Wind combs the yellow hills, salt crawls the air, and olive trees hold their breath as if each leaf were an ear. If you stand long enough on cracked flagstones at dusk, the heat releases slowly as if a buried body were exhaling. Crete does not tell stories with words. It tells them with corridors, with doors that open onto more doors, with thresholds too low for pride. Lesson 1. The labyrinth does not move, you do. And in moving, you are rewritten. Breath shortening, perception narrowing, the body rehearsing panic while the mind bargains with shadow. Lesson 2. Stone can be trained to listen. In those passages, sound folds back on itself so that every footfall returns as a question and every whisper comes home as accusation. Lesson 3. Corridors can be consecrated by rites until they develop a memory of their own. They called it a maze to make it sound like a trick of architecture. It was not a trick. It was an appetite with walls, a geometry sharpened into law. Minos did not hide his shame. He institutionalized it. He learned what rulers discover late. Fear, properly managed, is a currency sturdier than grain. So, a palace rose above and a palace beneath. Above, gypsum floors shone like water, red columns swelled downward like inverted trees, dolphins leapt across walls that forgot danger. Below, the air went stale, and speech learned to kneel. Turns and corners multiplied until the body understood that the shortest distance between 2 points can be obedience. Rituals were the language of those corridors, not the polite rinsing of cups, but ceilings so low the gods would have to bow. Torches sputtered against damp limestone. Smoke thickened until lungs remembered the sea. Honey sank into fissures. Milk trembled in clay bowls held by hands, pretending not to be afraid. Wine rose to mouths that had learned to chant through ache. The Labyrinth, the double axe, rode the air in slow arcs, as if measuring the space grief would need. Masks of bronze cooled faces into obedience. In that half-light, ritual was not theater. It was maintenance. Unfed corridors learn hunger, and when stone grows hungry, it asks for a name to bite. But rites do not stand alone. They travel a calendar. On certain moons, the sea changed voice, and the courtyards answered with steps, heels and palms beating a pattern the murals already knew. Horns cut from wood were lifted to the breeze and taught to speak like far thunder. Boys practiced landings on sand until the sand learned their names. Girls rehearsed hand over hand along ropes that smelled of salt and oil, the palm finding a prayer in friction. Even silence had choreography. 3 breaths in shadow before a doorway, 1 glance at the floor where the tile cooled in an omen's shape, then a turn so tight the lungs had to fold. A city is a schedule, worship is a ledger, the corridors collected both. Tribute is a clean word for dirty work. Every 9th year, ships came with youths and maidens, faces still bright with the first impatience of life. Athens would later blame the island. Empire prefers stories that absolve itself. But the corridors accepted bodies without complaint, and their names dissolved faster than their echoes. The audience above wanted a savior, so the story offered Theseus and a thread that could be drawn on pottery. He arrives late. Fear begins first. Below, walls do not applaud. They appraise. The thread pleases storytellers because it teaches anxiety to behave. Inside the maze, thread is only a thin excuse for hope. Ariadne stands at the hinge of that hope. She knows the corridors by rumor and by angle, by the way dust piles differently where air is thinking. She ties a knot that remembers you and teaches the thread to listen for your weight. She bargains in the language palaces understand, not romance, but terms. If the center can be found, it must be taught the cost of being found. If the exit can be followed, it must be taught the cost of leaving. The story likes to call it love. The walls call it logistics. Before the center, the breaking. Prisoners learned silence by measurement. Food arrived without the word for hunger. Water dripped in intervals almost rhythmic, almost and therefore maddening. Guards walked heavy for 3 paces, light for 4. People count when they cannot pray, and the count refused to fit comfort. The tortures were not loud. Loudness is merciful. It ends. They were orderly, like taxation. A bowl of sleep taken away, a syllable removed from a name until the bearer no longer recognized the call, a rope tied not tight enough to bruise, only tight enough to turn a limb into an opinion. The floor still remembers, low soot along a ceiling from a torch carried by someone who already knew where to lower a head, shallow gouges from a bronze blade swung at limestone, a print the size of a knee where a body knelt longer than a prayer. Whether a horned shadow stepped forward or a masked priest stepped into the role, the confrontation was not swift. Courage is fast when it is real. Commerce is slow. The center made an offer. All centers do. And Ariadne's hand, the thread in the hero's palm, was not only mercy, it was a leash. And leashes work in both directions. Look up at the bull leapers. The long eyes, the taut jaws. The blue that breathes across the background is not sky, but water, the color of passage. Spirals beneath hooves are not decoration, they are diagrams. Lean close and read the planned hesitation of a turning, the place where a wall steals a breath and learns the tempo of fear. The double axe appears again and again, not as weapon, but as hinge, a way to split a life into before and after. In one corner, a painted woman holds a coil of thread with her knuckles turned the wrong way, as if the painter knew that to grip a lifeline too tightly is to make the exit forget you. Even the dolphins swim in rings tighter than nature requires, a rehearsal for concentric thought. Frescoes on Crete are manuals wearing jewelry. Murals do not work alone, floors are their footnotes. The same spiral that pleases the eye steals a step from the ankle. The same border that frames a scene frames a decision. Do you breathe here or there? A patch of blue at door height is not ocean. It is instruction. Take water into the lungs before the turn. A dot of red above a lintel is not flower, it is notice, bend. The painter was not only an artist. The painter was a supervisor of traffic in a building where traffic had to behave. Archaeology is a kind of prayer for the careful. You kneel, you brush, you breathe shallow so you do not move the dust you read. In those kneelings, the island offered small betrayals. In a sanctuary on a northern slope, ankle bones argued human, and the altar was stained where stone does not learn color from wine. In a low cave to the east, grooves told of something heavy, dragged without haste again and again. At shoulder height, the wall wore the polish of waiting hands. In deeper tunnels, thin channels the width of a finger led to a hole too cleanly cut to call an accident. Reports labeled it a drain. The stone used its truer word, mouth. Elsewhere, scratch marks spaced like the reach of restrained arms, a corner incised by rope burn, doing its long work. Tablets full of oil, cattle, bronze. Lists that comfort because they do not accuse. There is, too, the rumor of the builder. Call him Daedalus if you need a name. The hands that drew corridors like sentences also drew an apology into the plan. Two places where air runs contrary to reason, two stones that ring different when tapped, two lines of sight that cross like a secret handshake. He knew that a perfect trap is an imperfect confession. Later, when feathers and wax pretended to be a second architecture, you can almost hear the palace laugh. Another corridor, this one made of wind. Another wall, this one made of sunlight. The island does not begrudge escape attempts. They are proof the corridors are working. Atlantis is what you call a memory when it must fit inside a legend. Concentric rings, city, water, like a labyrinth taught to float. Bulls for weather, mariners who bullied horizon and end fast enough to look like judgment. If the labyrinth is tied inland, Atlantis is tied in government. Minos borrowed administration from the ocean's curriculum. Keep the center sacred, keep the outer rings busy, send tribute inward as pulse. When Thera threw its heart into the sky and the sea came home too far, the surface lost its furniture. Below, the corridors noticed the obvious. The pattern above had always been their echo. The age chose a miracle over an audit because an audit would have admitted the island's debt to its own dark. Sea logic governs more than ships. The palace learns to breathe in sets like waves. Processions in, processions out. Inventories rise and fall like tide. Even justice is tidal, harsh at the center, forgiving at the edges, then harsh again when the moon of politics demands. You can chart it if you like. How many jars of oil for 1 year's calm? How many hides for 1 year's storm? How many names for a decade of forgetting? The ocean keeps the accounts with salt. The corridors keep them with temperature. Erasure has a payroll. Athens needed a monstrous Crete to flatter its cleverness. Later empires preferred columns to corridors. Religion arrived with new laws and a fresh broom, and blood learned chalices whose theology renamed it. Museums turned instruments into artifacts, as if employment had been the sin. To silence a labyrinth, pave above it, and call the paving culture. Teach a hero with a string. Forget on purpose, because remembering makes the food taste wrong. Yet nothing human is perfectly buried. Winds still carry a smell like hot coins and milk cooling in a dark room. Old men spit 3 times without knowing why. Fishermen say their lines catch on nothing just offshore, as if a street continued into the sea and refused to forgive hooks. A mason strikes hollowness where solid should be and covers it quickly with stones laid not for strength but for silence. Even the language collaborated with forgetting. Scribes taught numbers to behave and let stories wander off. Clay tablets baked themselves into obedience and kept lists that fed ships, soldiers, kitchens, rows of symbols that make a scholar proud and a corridor smile. You can rebuild a pantry from a tablet. You cannot rebuild a prayer. So the pantry survives the fire, the prayer survives as rumor, the corridor survives as habit. When tourists read the captions, they learn what was counted. When the island breathes at dusk, it reveals what was priced. The hero leaves, as heroes do, with a headline that fits on a single line. The thread gleams, the boat cuts water, a city cheers its own reflection. Ariadne stands between verses on a shore that cannot decide whether she is reward or evidence. Some stories say she sleeps and wakes abandoned. Others invent a god to collect her, like a debt come due. Both versions flatter the ledger. Either way, the corridor gets what it wants. A narrative that looks like closure and feels like interest. What of the years after? Corridors are patient architectures. Men are impatient animals. The palace learned to call certain doors storage, certain thresholds service, certain rooms ceremony. And the names worked until they didn't. A drought rearranged priorities. A tremor revised a hallway into a lesson. A new ruler preferred sunlight and called meetings on the roof. But below, the old policy kept its shift. That is the cruelty of systems that work. They work even when the story changes costumes. There are places where the ceiling dips low enough that you must bend. There are places where the wall bulges, as if something behind it is practicing being born. There is a junction where cold air flows without source, and it smells not of rot, which is an honest smell, but of metal that has learned to sweat. In one chamber the floor is slightly convex. Lie down there, and you will roll toward the center no matter your will. In another, the floor bears tiny channels, vessels no wider than a finger's width, leading to a hole too neatly cut to call an accident. Rites explain architecture. Architecture creates rights. You build a trough, and the world finds a reason for it to exist. Silence hid the labyrinth as effectively as any wall. The scribes learned to carve plenty, cattle tallies, oil rations, bronze ingots counted with a care that would shame accountants, but they left no stories where they could be found. The language used to run the island's kitchen and dock and armory burned with the stores, crumbled with the walls, drowned in the ash from the mountain that spat up its heart. And later tongues, high with clarity and full of laws, preferred heroes who solved problems with wit and string. Libraries love order, corridors love compromise. When the readers arrived centuries later, they congratulated themselves on deciphering a language that gave them lists. Lists comfort, they do not accuse. In the absence of accusation, you can convince yourself the axe was a ceremonial thing and the bull a metaphor, and that red is only paint when it dries dark on stone. There were attempts to speak again of what the island knew. Old women told grandchildren not to play in certain ravines because the earth there remembers how to narrow, and children who learn to run straight are not prepared for the kind of turn those walls prefer. Shepherds refused to shelter in certain mouths of rock, even in lightning, because thunder is an honest god and that other sound is not. Diggers found a corridor and called it a story because stories can be folded and placed in pockets. A traveler once returned to the port pale as tallow and described a place underground where the air tasted of coins and winter, where the light from his lamp curved a little as if sight itself might have to bend to proceed. He showed a sketch to a clerk who later denied receiving it because denial is a salary you can spend anywhere. Was the Minotaur real? The question flatters the age that asks it. Real like teeth? Real like law? Real like debt? There are skulls in the island's soil with horns still stubborn to their sockets. Ceremonial, they will tell you, because ceremony comforts the scholar who must write the report. There are jawbones heavy enough to swing like a bell. There are bones of the young, piled with the care one gives to inventory, not burial. There are limestone blocks polished at horn height, an abrasion that makes no sense, unless something tall and accustomed to rubbing passed there often. There is a bronze mask, no, a fragment of one, green with rest, its nostrils flared, its interior scored by the scratches of a face that tried to breathe and made a language out of fog. Real is an unkind word here. What was at the center broke what came to find it. What survived climbed a rope of noise until it remembered the word for daylight. The connection no one was supposed to speak of, Labyrinth to Atlantis, has another angle too. Concentric rings are not only an engineering marvel, they are a governance philosophy. Sanctify the center, keep the margins occupied, pull the pulse of tribute inward like tide, and you can call the hunger holiness without being contradicted by anything the eye can measure. The sea enforces it by drowning what asks too many questions. The corridors enforce it by bewildering what refuses to kneel. Civilizations learn to call this stability. Art learns to paint it as grace. Tour guides learn to smile at it under noon's polite assault. Listen, above, the palace still makes tourists feel tall, the dolphins still swim in paint that refuses fatigue, and the columns still widen downward to remind pride which way roots grow. Below, an idea that began as utility and matured into liturgy waits for the next age to misname it. A hero will be offered. A monster will be blamed. A city will be praised for its thread. The truth remains in the walls. Appetites can be taught to administrate themselves, and once administration learns secrecy, history becomes a chorus whose lyrics are chosen by the best-funded voice. When you leave, if you leave, do not follow a string. Follow the taste in your mouth. If it is salt, thank the sea and keep moving. If it is iron, consider your options. Heroes are expensive. Systems are cheap. The island prefers solvency. The labyrinth does not move. You do. And in moving, you are rewritten. So if a thread is a leash, who is holding the other end?